Hello, and welcome to the weekly economic brief. My name is Dr. Lindsay Piegza, Chief Economist at Stifel. Last week, all eyes were on the latest inflation data with an updated read on both producer and consumer prices, indicating a further reduction in top-line price pressures. On Tuesday, the PPI rose zero point 0.1 in July, a tenth of a percentage point less than expected, and following a larger 0.2% gain the month prior. Year-over-year, producer prices rose 2.2% in July, down noticeably from the 2.6% annual gain in June, and now marking the smallest annual increase since April. Of course, while a continued step in the right direction, after reversing course and rising for 5 consecutive months, now with 1 month of reprieve, headline price pressures are simply back to where they were in April, still nearly 200 basis points above the previous low of just 0.3 of a percentage point reached in June of last year. Excluding food and energy, the core PPI was flat in July, the smallest monthly increase in 7 months, and following a larger 0.3% rise in June. Year over year, the core PPI increased 2.4% in July. Now, like the headline, this is a noticeable improvement from last month's pace of 3% and the smallest annual increase in 3 months. Yet the core remains 60 basis points above the previous low of 1.8% reached in December. Additionally, excluding food, energy, and trade, now here producer costs showed significantly less improvement. In fact, this more narrow measure rose zero point 0.3 in July, the largest monthly gain in 3 months. And over the past 12 months, the core PPI excluding trade rose 3.3%, up from a 3.2% pace in June, and now marking the hottest reading since May. Turning to consumer prices, the CPI rose zero point 0.2 in July, as expected, but following an outright decline of 0.1 in June. Year over year, consumer prices rose 2.9%, a tenth of a percentage point below expectations, and down from the 3% annual increase in June. Now, excluding food and energy costs, the core CPI rose zero point 0.2 in July, also in line with expectations, but like the headline, a larger monthly increase relative to a more muted 0.1% gain in June. Year over year, the core CPI increased 3.2%, down 0.1 of a percentage point from the prior read, and now marking the slowest pace since April of 21. And finally, looking at another iteration of inflation, the supercore, defined as core services excluding housing. The supercore rose 0.2 in July, again continuing the trend of a hotter monthly rise, at least relative to June, which posted a 0.1% decline. Over the past 12 months, the supercore increased 4.4%, down from the 4.6% annual pace in June, and the smallest gain in 5 months, albeit still more than double the Fed's intended 2% target. In the context of Fed policy, remember the July FOMC statement offered no guarantee of a September rate cut, falling well short of the market's expectations for a commitment to policy easing. A September rate cut is still very much a possibility, an increasingly likely possibility at this point. And in fact, with a more favorable reading on the CPI and the PPI last week, a September rate cut is priced in at certainty, according to the CME FedWatch tool. But the statement suggests the Fed remains data dependent and that policymakers are not yet convinced by recent reports that price pressures will continue to moderate or that labor market conditions have cooled enough to warrant an adjustment in the current policy stance. Taken together, disinflationary progress continues, but the committee is looking for additional indications of sustainable progress back towards the 2% inflation objective. Now, that's not to say that the Fed needs to or will wait until 2% is met, but the trajectory of inflation still remains bumpy and uneven at best. So policymakers, somewhat desperate to provide relief, will continue to put a heightened level of importance on the incoming data between now and the September 18th FOMC meeting. That being said, it does appear that the onus is on the data to convince policymakers not to move come September, meaning any further minimal progress in price pressures is likely enough to offer the needed justification to cut rates next month. In fact, coupled with that cooler July employment report, if the more favorable headline descent, as we saw last week in the CPI and PPI, is confirmed by the July PCE report that's released on August 30th, well, then even the skeptics among the committee are going to find it difficult to fend off the doves, ready to initiate liftoff towards a less firm policy stance. As Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic noted last week, in the aftermath of the latest inflation data, price pressures have now clearly reverted back to the earlier disinflationary trajectory that was established prior to the first quarter. And should that trajectory be maintained, Bostic says, a rate cut, quote, is coming. Of course, even if policymakers did opt to open the door to rate cuts as early as September, they will likely fall short of the market's desire to rush back to neutral, let alone revert back to an accommodative stance anytime soon. Meaning, even under the more favorable inflation scenario of ongoing, albeit minimal, easing in price pressures, the Fed will likely opt to move in a slow and tempered pace, keeping rates well above neutral out beyond at least 2025, if not longer. Aside from inflation, an updated look at the consumer showed further evidence of ongoing resilience. Top-line retail sales rose 1% in July, the largest monthly gain since January of last year, and 2.7% year over year. The gains were widespread, with 10 of the report's 13 categories posting increases, including a sizable rebound in car sales following last month's cyber attack on auto dealers, along with a pickup in electronic sales, food and beverage sales, and e-commerce. Gasoline station sales also gained for the month, up 0.1 of a percentage point, following 2 consecutive months of decline. Excluding the upward pressure from autos and gasoline station sales, core retail sales rose 0.4 in July, the third month of expansion, and 3.4% on an annual basis. In fact, stripping out even more volatility and excluding food, autos, building materials, and gasoline station sales, control group sales, which feed directly into the GDP calculation, rose 0.3 in July, also the third month of positive sales activity, and 3.7% over the past 12 months. Of course, while the annual pace in the control group remains solid near 4%, this is still a noticeable loss of momentum from 4.7% at the end of the first quarter. And the final data points from last week offered a latest look at housing, with data showing ongoing pressure, downward pressure, on housing activity. Housing starts fell near 7% in July, significantly more than expected, pulling the annual pace down from 1.3 million to 1.2 million. Now, the weakness was primarily a reflection of single-family starts, off 14% for the month, the largest monthly decline since early 2020. Year over year, housing starts remain in the red, down 16%. Building permits, meanwhile, fell 4% in July from 1.5 million to a 1.4 million unit pace. Single-family permits fell 0.1%, the sixth consecutive month of decline, while multifamily permits fell 11.1%, nearly offsetting last month's increase of 16.3%. This week, the economic calendar begins today with the July leading index, followed by weekly mortgage applications on Wednesday, and later in the week on Thursday, weekly jobless claims, the Chicago Fed National Activity Index, along with the S&P Global readings for ISM manufacturing, services, and composite PMIs, July existing home sales, and the Kansas City Fed Manufacturing Activity Index. And wrapping up the week Friday, we'll take a look at new home sales for July. And finally, on the Fed speak front, it's pretty light this week, but we will hear from Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic on Tuesday, followed by the July 31st FOMC meeting minutes scheduled for release on Wednesday. While the statement did leave the door open for a potential September increase, the statement noted that the committee was not yet confident in the current disinflationary trend to justify a pivot in policy, at least not yet. Investors will be reading closely between the lines to see what Fed officials were looking for to gain more assurance and to then move forward with the first round cut, potentially now in just about 4 weeks' time. And with that, I'd like to thank you for starting your week with Stifel.